luxury hotel humiliated and kicked out Morgan Freeman, without realizing who he would turn out to be the next day. Subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The lobby of the Regal Crest Hotel was the epitome of luxury and exclusivity. The polished marble floors gleamed under the glow of enormous crystal chandeliers, which hung from the ceiling like intricate works of art. Every detail of the decor radiated wealth. Plush armchairs draped in rich velvet, paintings by renowned artists gracing the walls, and gold accents that caught the light, casting a dazzling yet imposing atmosphere. The guests who occupied the space seemed to belong to another world. Men in finely tailored suits spoke in low, confident tones, their Rolex watches flashing under the elegant lighting. Women glided through the room in designer evening gowns, their laughter soft yet deliberate, as though every glance in their direction was an assessment of their worth. They gathered in small circles, sipping champagne from delicate crystal glasses, their conversations a careful mix of business dealings and polite social pleasantries. To them, the hotel was more than just a place to stay. It was a stage where their status was affirmed and displayed. The staff matched the hotel's ambience with their flawless presentation. The women at the reception desk wore custom-tailored uniforms, their hair styled into identical, sleek buns. The men, dressed in crisp black suits with perfectly knotted ties, moved with precision and professionalism. Their smiles were polite but distant, carefully measured to maintain a sense of exclusivity. They carried themselves with an air of refinement, welcoming only those who, in their eyes, belonged. Through the revolving glass doors stepped Morgan Freeman. Unlike the other guests, he wore a simple outfit: a pair of faded jeans, a navy sweater, and a well-worn leather jacket. A brown travel bag hung over his shoulder, marked by creases and scuffs from years on the road. His face, recognized by millions, was etched with exhaustion from a relentless filming schedule. Tonight, all he wanted was a quiet place to rest. At first, his presence went unnoticed by the staff, who were preoccupied with assisting a guest dressed in an Armani suit. However, a couple seated near the grand staircase recognized him immediately. The woman gasped softly and leaned in to whisper to her companion. Morgan caught the subtle movement and offered a faint smile, nodding in acknowledgement before quickly looking away, determined not to attract attention. Morgan Freeman approached the front desk, standing patiently as he waited for his turn. The lobby buzzed with quiet conversations and the occasional clinking of glasses, but he remained focused on the receptionist in front of him. She was a young woman with icy blue eyes and a polished, professional smile. When she finally glanced in his direction, her gaze flickered over his appearance. Though her expression remained neutral, Morgan sensed the subtle shift in her demeanor, a stiffening of posture, a slight narrowing of her eyes. Clearing her throat delicately, she finally addressed him. "Yes, can I help you?" Her tone was cordial, but carried a formal distance, as if she had already decided he didn't belong. Morgan stepped forward, setting his worn leather bag gently on the floor. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and even. "I'd like a room for the night. I don't have a reservation, but I'm happy to pay whatever is required." The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if weighing her words. "I see. One moment, please." She began typing, maintaining her polite smile, but something about it felt forced now, mechanical. Her eyes darted between the screen and Morgan before she finally spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It seems we don't have any rooms available tonight." Morgan frowned slightly, his gaze drifting past her to the expansive lobby beyond. Golden elevator doors gleamed under the chandelier lights, waiting to take guests to their luxurious suites. The hotel was grand, spacious, far from full. "No rooms at all?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. The receptionist's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "Unfortunately, we're fully booked," she said, her tone sharper now, as if signaling the conversation was over. Morgan nodded slowly, adjusting the strap of his bag. "That's strange," he said, his voice still calm. I've stayed here before and never had an issue finding a room. Are you sure there's nothing available?" Their exchange had not gone unnoticed. A security guard stationed near the entrance, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a watchful gaze, took notice of Morgan lingering at the desk. His eyes locked onto the scene, and after a brief moment, he began to move toward them. The receptionist, perhaps emboldened by the guard's presence, straightened her posture. "I'm sorry, sir," she repeated, this time louder. "But we cannot accommodate you tonight. You may want to try another establishment." Morgan exhaled slowly, his frustration evident but controlled. "All right," he said, reaching into his pocket for his phone. "I'll just check online. Maybe there's a cancellation or something." Before he could proceed, the security guard stepped forward. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his deep voice carrying an authoritative edge. The receptionist quickly seized the opportunity. "Yes," she replied, casting a quick glance at Morgan. "This gentleman was just leaving." Morgan turned to the guard, meeting his gaze with calm resolve. "I'm not causing any trouble," he said evenly. "I just want to book a room." The guard crossed his arms, his stance firm. "Sir, if the hotel is fully booked, there's nothing we can do. I suggest you move along." Morgan opened his mouth to respond, but the guard's unwavering tone left little room for argument. The receptionist, now emboldened, added, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir." Morgan studied her face for a moment, then exhaled, stepping back. His shoulders slumped slightly, not from defeat but from exhaustion. He picked up his bag and turned toward the exit. As he walked away, he could feel the weight of their gazes on him. The receptionist's dismissive glance, the guard's watchful, suspicious stare, and the quiet murmurs of guests who had witnessed the entire exchange. The sting of humiliation was sharp, but Morgan pushed forward, stepping into the night, knowing that this moment would not be forgotten. The sting of humiliation was sharp, but Morgan Freeman swallowed it, pushing open the heavy glass doors and stepping out into the cold night. The air outside the Regal Crest Hotel was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. He stood beneath the awning for a moment, his fingers tightening around the strap of his bag. The polished glass of the hotel doors reflected his weary figure, but he barely glanced at it. Behind him, the golden glow of the lobby seemed even more distant. Another world, one he was no longer welcome in. He exhaled deeply, letting the rejection settle before stepping onto the wet pavement. The streetlights cast long, pale shadows, and the drizzle picked up, turning the city's lights into blurred streaks of color. Morgan walked slowly, his footsteps echoing against the deserted sidewalks. Despite his exhaustion, his mind replayed the events inside the hotel. The receptionist's condescending tone, the guard's authoritative stance, the cold dismissal. It all lingered like an ache in his chest. It wasn't the first time he had faced such treatment, but this time it hit differently. Maybe it was because he had let his guard down, assuming that at this stage in his life he had earned the right to be treated with dignity. His fingers hovered over his phone, contemplating calling his assistant to book another hotel. But pride held him back. He didn't want to turn this into a spectacle. Instead, he kept walking, letting the steady rhythm of his steps drown out the voice in his head that kept asking, "Why didn't I fight back?" By the time he circled back near the hotel, the drizzle had turned into a steady downpour. Across the street, he stood in the shadows, watching as sleek luxury cars pulled up, their drivers rushing to shield guests with umbrellas. The contrast was stark. Inside, warmth and comfort. Outside, cold and exclusion. Morgan lingered near the street lamp, half hidden in the darkness, lost in thought. He didn't notice the two figures emerging from the hotel until one of them called out, "Hey, you again!" He turned slowly. It was the same security guard from earlier, now accompanied by a younger man with a more aggressive demeanor. They crossed the street toward him, their steps purposeful. "You need to move along," the older guard said, his voice firm over the sound of the rain. Morgan squared his shoulders. "I'm not causing any trouble. I just—" "Didn't you hear him?" the younger guard interrupted, stepping closer. "You're loitering. People are starting to notice." Morgan's patience thinned. "People are noticing because you're making a scene," he replied evenly. The younger guard scoffed. "Don't get smart with me." Morgan met his gaze without flinching. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm standing here minding my own business." The older guard reached for Morgan's arm, and instinctively, Morgan stepped back. "Sir, I'm asking you to leave the premises," the guard said, his tone sharper now. "And I'm asking you to stop treating me like a criminal," Morgan shot back. Without warning, the younger guard grabbed Morgan's bag, yanking it roughly. "We don't have time for this." Morgan yanked his bag free, his voice rising. "Don't touch me." By now, a few passers-by had slowed, casting curious glances. The older guard noticed and lowered his voice, though his tone remained firm. "Sir, if you don't leave, we'll have no choice but to call the police." Morgan took a step back, raising his hands in frustration. "Fine, I'm leaving." But the younger guard wasn't done. As Morgan turned, the man muttered under his breath, "You better." Then, just loud enough for Morgan to hear, he added, "Should have known better than to let someone like you hang around." Morgan froze. The words hung in the air, heavier than the rain. He turned slowly, locking eyes with the guard. "Someone like me?" The younger man smirked. "You heard me." Morgan felt the heat rise in his chest, but he swallowed his anger, unwilling to let the moment escalate further. Instead, he shook his head, turned, and walked away. Behind him, he heard the guards muttering to each other, their voices dissolving into the rain. The night stretched on, and Morgan wandered through the quiet streets, his clothes damp, his spirit heavier with each passing hour. Eventually, he found himself in a small park, where he collapsed onto a bench beneath a flickering street lamp. The rain had slowed, but the chill remained, seeping into his bones. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, leaning back against the cold metal. Memories surfaced, unbidden, moments from his childhood, from his early career, from times when he had faced similar walls. He had always pushed through, always kept his composure. But tonight, the weight of it all felt unbearable. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the contacts list. His assistant's name was there, just a tap away. He could fix this. One call, and by morning the hotel would be issuing apologies. But something inside him resisted. He had fought too long and too hard to still be dealing with this. And now, instead of anger, something deeper settled in him. Resolve. He scrolled past his assistant's number and instead dialed another. The phone rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Morgan, it's late." Morgan sat up straighter, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I need you to look into something for me," he said. "The Regal Crest Hotel. Who owns it?" There was a pause. "Why? What happened?" Morgan glanced up at the dark sky. "I just need the information. And quickly." Now, instead of anger, there was something deeper, a quiet but unwavering resolve. Morgan Freeman scrolled past his assistant's number and instead called his attorney. The phone rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Morgan, it's late." "I need you to look into something for me," Morgan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "The Regal Crest Hotel. Who owns it?" There was a pause. "Why? What happened?" Morgan glanced up at the darkened sky. "I just need the information, and quickly." By dawn, the rain had stopped, but Morgan was still sitting on the bench, his jacket soaked through. The chill had settled into his bones, but his mind had never been clearer. This time, he wasn't just going to walk away. He had made his decision. The first streaks of morning light stretched across the horizon, bathing the empty streets in a pale glow. Morgan remained motionless on the damp bench, his fingers curled tightly around the strap of his bag. The city was beginning to stir. Early risers shuffled past, some casting curious glances, others hurrying by without a second thought. He had spent the night beneath the weak glow of a flickering street lamp, its dim light offering little warmth. As the hours dragged on, his thoughts shifted. At first, he replayed the scene at the hotel, the receptionist's dismissive glance, the security guard's rough treatment, the way their words had cut deeper than he wanted to admit. But as the night faded into morning, anger gave way to clarity. He wasn't just another man turned away at the door. He was Morgan Freeman, a name that carried weight, a name built on perseverance and dignity. And yet, here he was. Exhaling slowly, his breath visible in the crisp morning air, he reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. The battery was nearly dead, a fitting symbol of his depleted energy, but it had just enough charge for one more call. He scrolled through his contacts, pausing briefly at his assistant's name before moving past it. Instead, he dialed his lawyer. "Morning, Morgan," came the voice on the other end, sharper now than it had been hours earlier. "I've been up since you called. I've got the information you wanted." Morgan sat up straighter. "Tell me." The Regal Crest is part of a boutique chain owned by a private equity group called Fairmont Holdings. It's their flagship property, but they're struggling financially. High overhead, declining bookings, and some bad press last year about discriminatory practices, although they managed to sweep that under the rug. Morgan's grip on the phone tightened. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough. They're looking for buyers, but haven't found any serious offers yet. The chain's bleeding money, and the Regal Crest is dragging them down." A small, bitter smile crept onto Morgan's face. "Perfect." His lawyer hesitated. "Morgan, what are you thinking?" Morgan looked up at the sky, the first rays of sunlight warming his face. "I'm thinking it's time someone taught them a lesson." Over the next few hours, Morgan sat in a quiet cafe, sipping black coffee while using the restroom's hand dryer to dry his soaked clothes. By the time he stepped back out into the city, his determination had solidified into a plan. He pulled out his phone and made another call, this time to his financial advisor. The wheels were now in motion. For the next 3 days, Morgan stayed out of the spotlight. He worked behind the scenes, holding meetings in quiet offices and exchanging calls with lawyers and consultants. His team was small but efficient, combing through Fairmont Holdings' financial records and negotiating terms. It wasn't easy. The chain's owners were cautious, asking probing questions and stalling discussions. But Morgan's reputation carried weight. When he made it clear that he was serious and that he had the resources to back it up, their resistance began to crumble. By the 4th day, the paperwork was nearly complete. Morgan sat in a sleek boardroom overlooking the city skyline, surrounded by lawyers and executives. In front of him, the contract lay heavy with legal jargon and signatures. One of the executives, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and nervous eyes, cleared his throat. "Mr. Freeman, are you sure about this? The hotel, it needs work, a lot of work." Morgan leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "I'm sure." The man hesitated, then nodded and slid the final page across the table. Morgan picked up the pen, signing his name with a firm, unwavering hand. Just like that, the Regal Crest was his. His return to the hotel was deliberate. Every step, every decision, every moment had led to this. But this time, he wasn't arriving as an unwanted guest. He was arriving as the owner. Morgan Freeman stepped out of a sleek black luxury car, flanked by his lawyer, a public relations manager, and a small team of journalists. Camera flashes lit up the entrance as he crossed the marble lobby, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. The staff froze in place, their eyes widening as recognition set in. The receptionist from his first visit stood behind the front desk, her face draining of color the moment she met his gaze. The weight of realization hung heavy in the air. Morgan walked forward, his expression calm yet unwavering. Setting his bag down on the counter, he spoke with quiet authority. "I believe I'll take that room now," he said, his voice steady but carrying enough weight to silence the whispers that had started around him. Before the receptionist could stammer a response, the hotel's manager appeared. He was the same man who had sneered at Morgan just days earlier, but now his confidence was gone. His steps were hesitant, his face pale, and his hands clasped nervously in front of him. "Mr. Freeman," he began, his voice strained, "welcome back. I wasn't expecting." Morgan raised a hand, cutting him off. "I know," he said. "You weren't expecting me to own this place." The manager's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He stood there speechless as Morgan turned his attention to the gathered staff. "Let me make this clear," Morgan said, his voice steady and deliberate. "Things are going to change around here, starting today." The journalists leaned in, cameras rolling, capturing every word. Morgan didn't flinch under the scrutiny. "Discrimination has no place in this hotel or anywhere else," he continued. "What happened to me should never happen to anyone, and I won't stand for it." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. The manager's shoulders sagged under the weight of the moment. "Some of you," Morgan said, sweeping his gaze across the room, "are going to have to answer for your actions. Others will have the chance to prove they're better than this. But make no mistake, this is no longer the Regal Crest Hotel you thought you knew." He turned back to the manager. "We'll talk privately." The manager, his face ashen, nodded and led Morgan toward the back office. By the end of the day, the news had spread. The Regal Crest had a new owner, and its doors were closed for renovations. The staff members who had humiliated Morgan faced immediate consequences. Some were fired, while others were suspended pending investigation. But for Morgan, this was just the beginning. That evening, he stood in the now empty lobby, taking in the silence. Soon this place would be unrecognizable, and he was ready. The transformation of the Regal Crest began immediately. Gone were the hushed whispers of judgmental guests and the thinly veiled condescension of the staff. In their place, the room buzzed with activity. Workers in uniform carried tools and supplies. Ladders stretched toward the high ceilings, while protective sheets covered the once pristine marble floors. The rhythmic pounding of drills and hammers echoed through the grand space, a chorus of transformation. Morgan stood in the center of it all, his arms crossed as he surveyed the controlled chaos. It had been less than 48 hours since he finalized the purchase, but there was no time to waste. Every hour counted. The old staff had been dismissed or reassigned. Those who had shown genuine remorse were offered a second chance if they underwent mandatory training in diversity and inclusion. But the others, those whose prejudice had been undeniable, were gone. Morgan's message was clear. The new Regal Crest would not tolerate discrimination, not in policy and not in practice. As he turned, his lawyer approached, holding a stack of papers. "Everything's on track," she said, handing him a summary of the day's progress. "The permits for remodeling are secured, and the HR team has already started screening applicants for the new staff. We should have interviews set up by next week." Morgan nodded, flipping through the documents. "And the press?" he asked. His PR manager spoke up. "Still controlled. The coverage is focused on your acquisition and renovation plans. No leaks about the incident, at least not yet." Morgan exhaled, his mind focused on the work ahead. The hardest part was still to come. Yet, Morgan's jaw tightened. He knew the story wouldn't stay quiet forever. Someone would talk, and when they did, he wanted to be ready. The meeting with Fairmont Holdings had been tense. The company's executives were eager to offload the hotel, but not without a fight to save face. Morgan let his team handle most of the negotiations, speaking only when necessary to make his intentions clear. "This isn't just a business move," he had said, leaning forward in his chair. "It's personal." And they had understood. Now, standing in the gutted lobby, Morgan felt the full weight of that declaration. The hotel wasn't just a building, it was a symbol, one that had to be rebuilt from the ground up. He moved through the construction site, pausing to talk with workers and check the progress. The once grand chandeliers had been taken down for cleaning, and the gold accents were being stripped away. In their place, Morgan envisioned a space that was elegant yet welcoming, luxurious but unpretentious. His assistant caught up to him near the elevators. "The design team's ready for you," she said. Morgan followed her to a temporary office set up in one of the vacant meeting rooms. Blueprints covered the table, and designers stood ready with fabric swatches, color samples, and material selections. They presented their ideas: a warmer color palette, natural wood finishes, and softer lighting to replace the harsh, overly opulent decor. Morgan listened carefully, nodding along, occasionally asking questions or suggesting changes. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair. "This isn't just about aesthetics," he said. "It's about atmosphere. I want people to feel welcome the moment they walk through those doors. No more barriers, no more invisible lines dividing who belongs and who doesn't." The lead designer nodded, taking notes. "We'll make it happen." Later that evening, Morgan sat in the former manager's office. The room still bore traces of its previous occupant, the heavy oak desk, the leather chairs. But it felt emptier now, cleaner. He glanced at the files spread out before him. Resumes, disciplinary reports, employee evaluations. Each document told a story. Some were brief, reflecting a single lapse in judgment. Others revealed patterns of behavior that left little room for doubt. Morgan's lawyer entered, her expression unreadable. "Ready for the meeting?" He nodded. The staff gathered in the conference room, their faces a mix of anxiety and defiance. Morgan took his time, looking at each of them before speaking. "You all know why we're here," he began. "What happened last week wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a bigger problem. A culture that allowed discrimination to thrive unchecked." A murmur rippled through the room, but Morgan pressed on. "That ends now." He paused, letting the words settle. "Some of you are here because you believe in change. Others are here because you're hoping to keep your jobs. Either way, you're going to be held accountable." He gestured to his lawyer, who began reading names. The first to go was the manager. Morgan watched as the man stood, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. "You had a chance to lead by example," Morgan said. "Instead, you encouraged the behavior that brought us here." The manager didn't argue, he simply nodded and walked out. Next were the security guards. Morgan addressed them directly. "You treated me like a threat instead of a guest," he said. "That wasn't just unprofessional, it was unacceptable." Their protests were brief but futile. They were escorted out, leaving the remaining staff visibly shaken. Finally, Morgan turned to the receptionist. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling. I'm so sorry," she stammered. "I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to hurt anyone," Morgan interrupted. "But you did." She swallowed hard, tears spilling down her cheeks. Tears welled in the receptionist's eyes. "Please, give me another chance." Morgan studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "You'll have to earn it," he said firmly. "Mandatory training, regular evaluations, and no guarantee." She nodded quickly, relief washing over her face. The meeting concluded with Morgan laying out the new policies, strict codes of conduct, mandatory sensitivity training, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. He made it clear that the hotel would no longer cater to elitism. Instead, it would become a place where everyone felt welcome. By the time the staff filed out, the tension in the room had eased, but Morgan remained behind, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. This was only the beginning. The real work was still ahead. The newly remodeled conference room bore no resemblance to the cold corporate space it had once been. Gone were the gray walls and harsh fluorescent lighting. Instead, warm tones and soft lighting created an inviting atmosphere, less like a boardroom and more like a gathering space. Morgan had insisted on these changes. They might seem trivial to some, but to him they symbolized something larger. This was no longer a place for intimidation and unchecked authority. It was a place for honesty and accountability. The long, polished table was surrounded by the remaining staff. Their faces were tense and uncertain. The previous chapter of their lives, the outdated decor, the toxic culture they had once upheld, had been wiped away. Now, they faced the man who had exposed their failings and demanded change. Morgan stood at the head of the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was silent as he began. "You've all had time to think about what happened," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "And I've had time to think about what needs to happen next." He let the words settle before continuing. This hotel wasn't just broken physically, it was broken morally, and that kind of damage isn't fixed with a new coat of paint or fancy furniture. A few heads dipped, but no one spoke. The way I was treated when I walked through these doors wasn't just unprofessional, it was inhumane. But this isn't just about me. Morgan's voice sharpened. This hotel stood as a symbol of exclusion, elitism, and the idea that some people belong while others do not. That ends today. He paused, stepping back, letting the weight of his words linger. But change doesn't happen without accountability, and accountability starts now. Morgan turned to his assistant, who opened a folder and began reading names. The first was the former manager. Though he had already been dismissed, he was present as a symbolic gesture. He sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on the table. "Let's talk about leadership," Morgan said, directing his words at the man. "You had the power to set the tone for this hotel. Instead, you let prejudice take root. Worse, you encouraged it." The manager flinched, but didn't argue. He knew there was nothing left to say. "You're no longer part of this organization," Morgan continued, "and you won't be welcome back." The words were final. The manager rose, gathered his belongings, and walked out without looking back. Next came the two security guards. Morgan turned to face them directly. "You had a choice that night," he said, locking eyes with them. "You could have treated me with respect, the way any guest deserves to be treated." "A guest deserves to be treated with respect," Morgan said, his tone firm. "Instead, you chose force and intimidation." One of the guards opened his mouth to protest, but Morgan cut him off. "You saw me as a threat because of the way I looked. Don't deny it," he said, his voice unwavering, "and I can't let that kind of thinking stay in this building." Neither guard had a response. Their expressions flickered between frustration and resignation. But Morgan wasn't interested in excuses. Both guards were dismissed. Then he turned to the receptionist. She sat rigid in her chair, her eyes already glassy with tears. "You're still here," Morgan said, his voice softer now. "Do you know why?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "Because I believe people can change," he said. "But belief isn't enough. You need to prove that you're capable of learning from this." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. "You'll go through mandatory training," Morgan continued. "You'll be evaluated regularly, and if I see even a hint of the attitude you showed me that night, you're gone." "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Morgan replied. "Show me I didn't make a mistake." By the time the meeting ended, the staff that remained knew exactly where they stood. Morgan's expectations were clear. The old ways were gone. There would be no room for excuses. But accountability was only the first step. Morgan spent the next several weeks overseeing the training program personally. He sat in on workshops, listened to guest speakers, and participated in group discussions. He wanted the staff to see that these changes weren't just about policy. They were personal. Soon after, the new hires arrived. The recruitment process had been rigorous, with an emphasis on diversity and empathy. Morgan personally interviewed many of them, asking pointed questions about their values and experiences. He wanted people who understood what it meant to feel like an outsider, people who would treat every guest with respect, regardless of appearance or status. The transition wasn't easy. Some of the old staff struggled to adapt, while others embraced the change wholeheartedly. Morgan took note of both, quietly observing who was willing to grow and who wasn't. 1 month later, the hotel reopened under its new banner. The press was everywhere, eager to capture the transformation of the Regal Crest into a symbol of inclusivity. Morgan stood in the remodeled lobby, greeting guests as they arrived. He made a point of shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, ensuring that everyone who stepped through the doors felt welcome. The new staff mirrored his energy. They smiled warmly, assisted guests without hesitation, and moved with the confidence of people who knew they belonged. It wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was a statement. But the most powerful moment came later that evening. An elderly couple approached Morgan hesitantly. They were black, dressed modestly but neatly, and there was a nervousness in their eyes. "Mr. Freeman," the man said, his voice trembling, "we just wanted to thank you." Morgan frowned. "For what?" The woman smiled softly. "For giving us a place where we feel safe." She paused, glancing around the bustling lobby before continuing. "We've spent our lives being turned away or treated like we didn't belong, but here, tonight, we feel like we do." Morgan's throat tightened. He reached out, shaking the man's hand firmly. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. As the couple walked away, Morgan looked around the room. The sound of conversations, laughter, and the hum of life surrounded him. His heart swelled with something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of the Regal Crest's newly redesigned lobby. Its light danced across polished wood floors and soft earth-tone furnishings, casting a warm glow over the space. The chandeliers had been replaced with sleek, modern fixtures, elegant but without extravagance. Fresh flowers adorned the tables, and the scent of coffee and pastries filled the air, mingling with the quiet murmur of conversation. Morgan stood near the reception desk, his gaze moving across the room. Guests of all backgrounds filled the lobby: families with children, elderly couples, business travelers, and honeymooners. The diversity of faces and voices was a stark contrast to the uniformity that had once dominated this space. It was no longer a fortress of privilege. It was alive. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been sleepless nights, endless meetings, and more than a few moments of doubt. But now, as Morgan watched guests being greeted with genuine smiles and attentive service, he knew it had all been worth it. It had all been worth it. Morgan adjusted his suit jacket and stepped forward as a journalist approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Freeman," she began, "your purchase and transformation of the Regal Crest Hotel have captured national attention. Can you tell us what inspired you to take on this project?" Morgan smiled faintly, folding his hands in front of him. "Inspiration?" he echoed. "It wasn't inspiration, it was experience. I walked through these doors not long ago and saw what too many people see every day: a wall. Not a physical wall, but one built with prejudice and exclusion. I couldn't let that stand." The journalist leaned in. "And what message do you hope this hotel sends now?" Morgan's gaze swept the room before he answered. "That everyone belongs, no exceptions." The cameras captured his words, and Morgan could feel their weight. This wasn't just a soundbite for the evening news. It was a promise. Later that evening, the grand reopening ceremony was both elegant and inclusive. Community leaders, activists, and local artists mingled with business executives and reporters. Live jazz music filled the air, and tables were laden with food prepared by a diverse team of chefs. Midway through the night, as the music faded, Morgan took the stage. The room quieted. "Welcome," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I want to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight. This isn't just a celebration of a new hotel. It's a celebration of what happens when we refuse to accept the status quo, when we demand better and commit to making it happen." Applause rippled through the room, but Morgan raised his hand for silence. "I won't pretend this was easy," he continued. "There were moments when I questioned whether it was even possible, but every time I doubted, I thought about the people who came through these doors and didn't feel welcome, people who were turned away, ignored, or made to feel like they didn't belong. And I remembered that change doesn't happen unless we fight for it." The applause swelled again, louder this time. Morgan smiled. "This hotel stands as proof that we can do better, and we will." As the night wore on, Morgan slipped away from the crowd and stepped onto the terrace. The city lights stretched out before him, their glow reflecting off the river. He took a deep breath, letting the cool air ground him. Behind him, the glass doors opened. He turned to see the elderly couple he had spoken with earlier. They approached slowly, the woman holding her husband's arm for support. "We didn't mean to interrupt," the man said, his voice low. Morgan shook his head. "You're not interrupting at all." The woman stepped closer. "We just wanted to thank you again. We've been coming to this city for years, but we never thought we'd feel comfortable in a place like this." Morgan's chest tightened. "You shouldn't have had to feel that way." The man nodded. "But we did. And now we don't. That's because of you." Morgan smiled softly. "It's because of all of us." They exchanged a few more words before the couple turned to leave, but their gratitude lingered long after they were gone. In the weeks that followed, the Regal Crest became more than just a hotel. It became a destination, a symbol of inclusivity and progress. Reviews poured in, praising not only the renovations and service, but also the values the hotel now stood for. The Regal Crest was no longer just a hotel, it was a symbol of change. Guests praised not only the luxurious design and top-tier service, but also the values the hotel now embodied. Morgan Freeman made a point to visit often, not as an owner overseeing operations, but as a guest. He sat in the lounge, chatted with visitors, and paid attention to the small details that made people feel at home. One afternoon, he overheard a conversation between two young women at the cafe counter. "I heard the owner used to be treated badly here," one of them said. "Can you imagine? Someone like him?" The other shook her head. "He turned it around, though, and now it's one of the best places in the city." Morgan smiled to himself, taking another sip of his coffee. On his final visit before leaving town, Morgan stood in the lobby once more. This time he wasn't looking for flaws to fix or staff to evaluate. He was simply taking it all in. The laughter, the smiles, and the sense of belonging that now filled the space. The receptionist, the same one who had once dismissed him, approached nervously. She had completed her training and had proven herself over the past few months, but Morgan could still see a shadow of doubt in her eyes. "Mr. Freeman," she said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you for giving me another chance." Morgan met her gaze. "You earned it," he replied. "Just keep earning it." She nodded, her shoulders straightening with confidence as she returned to her post. Morgan turned to leave, pausing at the door for one last glance. The Regal Crest was more than a hotel now. It was proof that change was possible, that respect and dignity could replace judgment and exclusion. Stepping onto the street, his footsteps steady, Morgan knew the fight wasn't over. But this battle had been won. And for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends and family. Let this story inspire them too. Watch more videos for exciting stories with unexpected twists and turns.